Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Asim I Khwaja. I'm the Director for the Center for International Development at Harvard University. And today we are continuing with our fifth and as exciting as all the other four have been, panels on kind of post-COVID and how we think about sort of some of the biggest challenges we have been facing in the world post the crisis. Today, our series is going to be on the future of work. I am absolutely thrilled to have three incredible people joining me on this panel. I hope to benefit from both what they're going to say and from the discussion that will follow afterwards. We will have very detailed bios on all three, but let me very briefly introduce them. Our first who's going to speak is Guy Ryder, who is the Director General of the ILO. Guy, I'm just thrilled you took the time, I know at a particularly busy time, to join us, so thank you so much for doing that. Guy will be followed by Gordon Hanson, who is my own colleague at the Harvard Kennedy School. We will then have Ashley Williams, Whillans, who is a professor at the Harvard Business School. And with that, let me jump straight in. One of the intents in our panels is not just to raise a robust discussion on some of the biggest issues we're facing kind of during and post the pandemic, but also really start thinking about what are the potential silver linings, what are the opportunities we have seen. And we think that's going to be really important to highlight because if there is something positive that could come out from one of the biggest shocks we've seen in the last 100 years, it is that maybe we can disrupt the status quo a bit. Maybe we can start thinking about things which weren't going so well before the pandemic and find creative ways to address them. That is no more truer than in issues around labor, around future of work. That has drastically changed because of the pandemic, but perhaps there are some opportunities over here as well. So with that, I'm going to hand over directly to you, Guy. Thank you again for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed, and thanks for this opportunity. My greetings to everybody. Let me go to some of the questions you've put to us. What has been the impact of the pandemic? What have we seen so far? Well, I mean, this is the bad news. Our estimates show that the impact on jobs, the impact on labor income of the pandemic, if aggregated across the world, it's 4 times as severe as what happened in 2008, 2009 at the time of the financial crisis. This has been an enormous hit. That's the first thing to say. Yes, the global economy is beginning to grow back, but that 4% plus economic growth that we're seeing, the aggregates as always disguise a lot of the detail and a lot particularly of the diversity of experience. I'm not going to bury you with numbers, but we estimated that if you look at the actual number of hours actually worked, the hours actually worked in the world. In 2020, we lost the equivalent of 258 million full-time jobs in that year. Where the figure today, we estimate for 2022, is down to 52 million. So we're progressing, but we're way behind the starting line. So we're not out of this. So that's the bad news, which I know you're looking for silver linings, Asim. I have to give you the bad news to start off with. There's a bit more bad news. We're growing back horribly unequally. Now, to put it simply, Kristalina Georgieva talks about the dangerous divergence now in evidence in the recovery process. What's happening? The richer world, the advanced economies are bouncing back pretty quickly. Those of you joining from the United States know all about this. The developing and emerging economies are having a much harder time. Why? Because of unequal access to fiscal resources and stimulus, but also because of unequal vaccinations. So the bad news is we're going back incompletely on a fragile, unequal trajectory. And I think that has enormous implications for development processes and inequality in the world of work. Silver linings, they're not easy to find. I'm going to make the effort though, because you're encouraging us. I do think that COVID has enabled us, almost obliged us, to step back a little bit from the way the world of work has been. And I like the phrase you used, Asim, ways of disrupting or challenging the status quo, because, the pandemic didn't hit us from a standing start. Things were moving, things were changing. There were necessary transitions, be they digital, be they, and above all, the move to carbon neutrality through what we hope to be a process of just transition. Let's be honest, we were not doing well in handling any of those issues in the world of work. I think the opportunity of the pandemic is enable us to reset and think these through again. The question then is, how do we bring this about? And this is where we go to the lessons learned part of your question. Look, the problem is the following. If we just carry on as we were going before, we're not going to get to where we need to be. I fear that this unequal trajectory of recovery will make us build back worse. But if we do learn the lessons of the pandemic, it is that we need to reactivate and rededicate to what we call the institutions of labor, processes of negotiation, labor market regulation, consultation, and dialogue. I find some encouraging developments in the United States where encouragement of organizing labor is apparently finding its way into a putative legislative agenda, notwithstanding which, let's be honest, union density was down in the United States last year, not up. So there's not an easy way forward. But I do think that if we go back and say, look, we really have to put our minds and our politics and our institutions to work to design the future of work that we want, not just wish it into existence, then the pandemic would have taught us something. Thank you.
You've raised, it was very pithy, but you raised some really big questions. I want to come back to these questions, but before I do that, and one of the things I definitely want to come back is, I mean, both with your IELTS experience and your previous experience, the idea of what does it mean for international labor standards and regulation, and how do we build global institutions at a time when we faced a global pandemic? And I'd love to kind of hear your ideas there, particularly how we think about kind of the new world of remote work and stuff. How does that interface with that? Is that going to make, is the fact that we're all sitting in our little remote spaces going to make it harder to have collective progress be made? How do we coordinate in a virtual world? How do we negotiate in a virtual world? I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that as well. But before we do that, let me turn over to my colleague, Gordon. Gordon, the floor is yours now.
Thanks very much, Asim. And I want to follow Guy's lead in starting with the dark clouds and then moving to the silver lining, because I think there are a few more dark clouds to explore. And in addition to the monumental challenges that Guy outlined that we faced during COVID, we went into COVID with a series of challenges that were confronting less educated workers worldwide, manifesting themselves in different ways in different places, but had the common elements of low pay and flat pay trajectories, that increasingly unpredictable schedules, and among households with children, a preponderance of single-headed households, overwhelmingly women, and the challenge of childcare and managing schedules and trying to find ways to advance your career while having significant obligations at home. So combining that with COVID, these are big challenges. So where might the silver linings come from? Well, I would cite two. One is that we're in the process of rethinking global supply chains because we know that they're not terribly resilient to major shocks. That means that there are a bunch of supply chains that are in play, and business will be thinking about how they reorganize things in order to make those supply chains more resilient. That means at least some amount of bringing stuff closer to home, and closer to home means gains for poor regions that aren't that far from richer regions, and poorer countries that aren't that far from richer countries. So as we think about how to deal with logistics, geopolitical shocks, we now have this opportunity to help regions and places and people figure out how they insert themselves into the new opportunities that are going to arise. And we can talk more in kind of the Q&A about where exactly those opportunities might be. A related silver lining is regards the work from home issue. One of the major challenges we faced in the past about not having attractive opportunities for non-college workers is that skilled labor, and the most skilled labor in particular, was increasingly concentrated in a handful of superstar cities. We know that there are positive spillovers from the most productive workers to other workers, and if we're siloing the most productive folks away in a handful of places, we're not generating those spillovers all that widely. I don't want to overplay the work from home potential here because there's going to be lots of going back to the office, but I think we have a potential for creating a more democratic set of industry clusters, if you want to think of it that way, than we had in the past. None of this is going to happen, though, without a complementary set of policies. And so Guy kind of focused on the institutional features of that. I want to focus on a couple other features. One is focused worker training. We have great evidence from the last decade or so that sectoral training and active labor market training can help workers in positions of disadvantage pivot to new lines of work, and quite successfully. We have lots of evidence about how technical assistance to business in terms of helping them upgrade their operations can improve productivity, especially for smaller and medium-sized enterprises. And with the robust entrepreneurship we had in many places in the midst of COVID, there's a ready population of firms that are in need and that could benefit from that assistance. And finally, we have the challenge we had before COVID, now obviously more acute, which is rethinking the social safety net in a world in which work has changed dramatically. I think we now face more political and social pressure to do so, so that I see that as a silver lining, even though we're also aware of the fact that the deficiencies of that social safety net are worse than we had thought.
Gordon, thanks. Again, a really complimentary and nice set of issues. These are challenging issues, but I'm hoping, as you said, Gordon, that there are opportunities coming up. I love the idea of sort of rethinking global supply chains and how that could, to I think Guy's point, if we can have more systemic and structural change happening, use this shock as a way of sort of moving those things that are usually very hard to move. What are the right choices for us to make that would have kind of long-term payoff as well, both with dealing with the inequality issue, but also with dealing with kind of not just pay conditions in terms of wages, but also non-pecuniary conditions. Actually, I'm going to turn over to you. I know this is something, by the way, you've thought a lot about as well, which is, and as we discuss, I'd love to hear perhaps now or in our discussion later from you as well, in terms of how you think employer attitudes are changing. That's going to be one really important part of this equation as well. So over to Ashley.
Yes, that's a great segue to where most of my research focuses, which is on employee satisfaction and well-being. So like Gordon, like Guy, I'm going to start by revealing some of the research that I've been doing related to time use and well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic, and shedding some light on the negative consequences of this work from home, remote work, period of financial and economic uncertainty that we've been living through. So in research that I collected in Kenya and India, I have found similar patterns as globally representative data that I've collected worldwide. So what we observe is that time demands have increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, especially among employed women. So this is chores and childcare, and that these effects were relatively persistent throughout the COVID-19 lockdowns and beyond. So women are completing much more unpaid labor in terms of chores and childcare, and the amount of time that they're spending engaging in unpaid labor is having significant negative effects on subjective well-being. In one data set that I collected with informal workers living in Nairobi, Kenya, I saw that working women were doing more chores and childcare, and that this wasn't necessarily impacting their earnings relative to their male counterparts, but it was negatively impacting their subjective well-being. Women in this sample reported having less time to engage in passive leisure activities like resting and relaxing, which was undermining their self-reported satisfaction and increasing their stress. Now, I think that these additional time demands that women are facing, this has always been the case, but COVID-19 has shed light on these issues and made them something that many people are having discussions around. So one thing that I see as a positive outcome of the COVID-19 pandemic is this discussion, both in workplaces, but also among policymakers about what can we do, what systematic or systemic interventions can we provide, such as childcare, such as other kinds of time-saving services to reduce the burden of unpaid labor. In one experiment that my colleague and I recently published, we saw that alleviating time poverty among working women who are struggling to make ends meet had the same subjective well-being benefits as providing unconditional cash transfers. So providing meals and laundry services caused significant impacts in women's well-being that persisted after the interventions were removed. And these COVID-19 has shed light on and encouraged discussions around the importance of reducing time constraints that disproportionately affect women as we think about remaking our models of work going forward. I think trying to understand how to alleviate time poverty, not just financial constraints, is going to be a significant conversation and is increasingly important given that these time demands have been unevenly distributed during the COVID-19 pandemic and have been exacerbated. I think in terms of what workers are motivated by, so we did run some surveys right now looking at what is predicting employee engagement, and we see, unsurprisingly, that engaging in meaningful work, so the idea that workers today want meaning and purpose more than before. So we've conducted longitudinal panels tracking the importance of meaning and satisfaction in jobs as compared to financial rewards, and seeing that workers increasingly want, as a function of the COVID-19 pandemic and being in this unstable environment, they increasingly want meaning and to feel like their jobs matter. So this is going to be another important area to focus on going forward. We also see, again, in light of my research, that time affluence is one of the top 3 predictors of employee engagement right now. The extent to which organizations are taking employees' time affluence seriously is a key driver of employee engagement and commitment, even more than having a boss you like or having friends at work or perceptions of fair compensation in some of the data sets that we've been collecting in North American contexts. So this is going to be another key area, again, as I mentioned. And so as we're thinking about remaking our models of work, we need to ask ourselves, what is the optimal amount of flexibility? How can we have structured conversations, very deliberate conversations about when to come into the office and why? So we've been doing a lot of research in the North American context, looking at how knowledge workers should go back to work to produce fair and equitable outcomes for workers and to capitalize on the benefits of flexibility and try to overcome some of the challenges of the last years related to time demands and stress that especially working women are facing. So I think some silver linings are to have conversations about how to imbue all jobs with a sense of meaning and purpose. It's going to be increasingly important because that's what workers want today, as well as how to provide flexibility with some constraints such that the outcomes of flexibility are equitable for all employees in an organization.
Actually, thank you. That was fabulous. I love the kind of complementarity in a lot of what we're saying. Let me, based on what you said, let me start off by exactly, Ashley, where you left off, which is, let's for a second take the worker's perspective, and we'll come back to the employer's perspective in a second as well, and just the industrial landscape which is changing around us. From the worker's perspective, what I'm hearing Ashley you say, and what I heard Guy said earlier, and I'm also hearing this from Gordon as well, is that they are both changing expectations for workers about what they think is feasible, what is desirable, what is not desirable. They're changing opportunities. The landscape of work has changed. But as Guy said, and I want to come and add that theme to what we're saying, there's also a big issue of inequality and unequal access. Are we going to grow back the same way? Are we going to be able to bargain flexible positions the same way? Are we going to be negotiate meaning in jobs in the same way and equally across rich or poor, or privileged or unprivileged or underprivileged? Guy, let me turn back to you on that question. And I'm going to ask you, I'm going to put you a bit on the spot as both representing ILO, but just thinking, global thinking on this. How are we collectively negotiating that landscape? How are we representing these changing desires of workers, starting from, do we know what they are? And if they are, how are we helping them regionally navigate those discussions? And is there an opportunity in a world which is more globally linked to negotiate them in an international context? We have large firms which are across the world now. They have uniform labor policies which they may be applying. How are we getting into those conversations, or should we be getting into those conversations?
Look, I think this is a great way to take the conversation forward, and I really want to thank Ashley for starting us in the right place. I mean, the future of work that we want to design, the future of work is not written in the stars, it's for us to design, and hopefully it's for us to design in function of what we can understand working people want: job satisfaction, self-realization. You know, the ILO, when it was founded 100 years ago, talked about work as an act of self-realization. It sounds a little bit antique. What I would say is surely we understand work is a social activity, not social in its what it contributes to society, but actually the act of work should be a social event. And that's where I think the remote working, atomization of spatial work becomes very problematic. And I worry, to go to your question, Asim, that, I hear often anecdotally in the press, well, such and such a household name company has decided everybody's going to work from home from now on, 100%. Did anybody ask anybody if they wanted to do it that way? Or was it just, obeying a corporate logic? And vice versa, there are others saying, get vaccinated and come back. We're waiting for you here. The question which you're asking me, I think, and it goes to what I was trying to say about institutions of work, is we have to find the ways of capturing people's preferences. Of course, business needs are important in this regard, but the preferences and desires of working people are the other side of that equation. And what I worry that we've lost through the erosion of our institutions of negotiation and consultation is we've actually lost the means or the will to try and reconcile these two things. I think it is vitally important. And anybody who thinks, that there is a universal recipe for what the workplace of tomorrow should look like, I think should draw in their horns a bit and say, well, other people might actually have some ideas about what they would like. I want to also follow up on Ashley. If you give me time just to respond to a couple of points Gordon made, then I'll keep quiet. I also think that Ashley's reference to time poverty is fundamental. We developed a couple of years back, pre-pandemic, when we were going through our Future of Work centenary operation at the ILO, the notion of time sovereignty. That is to say that people should be able to exercise control and choice over their use of time. Now, I think these issues have become even more to the point. We've seen how, having to take on extra care responsibilities, very much in line with traditional role models, has given women an awful experience in general during the pandemic. And I think also the way that we've flexibilized working practices and working time make these issues of time as important as spatial distribution. And Gordon talked about space, and I want to come back to what he said. I agree that the redesign of global supply chains in spatial terms is really important. It's on the table. I don't know what way the cards are going to fall. We hear talk of reshoring and nearshoring on the basis of strategic autonomy, very much in the geopolitical mold, corporate robustness. What we hear a little bit less about is where the supply chain management debate has been sort of most marked in recent years internationally. And that's about due diligence in terms of respect of human rights and labor rights along supply chains. That element needs also to be taken into account. But I do take on board that the redesign of global supply chains offers opportunities to sort of deconcentrate the oases of good employment in certain locations and spread things out spatially. I think it's terribly important. And the work from home, I've already addressed it. I think we've got to try and break down the work from home thing into its constituent parts. We have the whole thing about the platform and the gig economy, which sometimes gets conflated with working from home. The other bit, of course, is where you are in a direct employment relationship with a known employer and they ask you not to come to a physical office anymore. I think, this is my personal opinion, that in the medium and longer term, what over here people like to call the dematerialization of the physical workplace inevitably will lead to the dematerialization of the employment relationship in ways which I think would bring in social consequences of a type which people aren't really thinking about right now. I would worry about that.
I want to pick up on a thread that there's several threads you've raised, Guy. One of the threads you've raised, and you could respond to it, but I want to bring us all into this conversation as well, is if I like the way you kind of rephrased it, the atomization of the workplace. If that is happening, and Ashley talked a lot about the surveys she's done, do we have systematic ways in this new world to get a sense of what workers want? Just their voices? How are their preferences being expressed? Normally in a worker-employer relationship, which is the material world, there are explicit ways of addressing this, there are collective ways of addressing this. Should we be thinking of investing in new ways to do preference revelation? Should it be done systematically? If the employer is no longer a simple employer, who are you communicating your preferences to even? So I want to kind of put these questions out there before we even think about how the employer will respond. Let's kind of get this employee voice through. So I don't know, Gordon, if you want to take any of these on, and I'd love to bring Ashley then quickly into this as well. Gordon.
Thank you. And sorry, my as part of the work from home challenges, my Zoom rebels at times and wants to take breaks at unscheduled intervals. So the challenge we face in figuring this out is actually knowing what these employment relationships look like. So Guy mentioned the dematerialization of the workplace. We also have the dematerialization of data about modern work arrangements. Our colleague here at the Kennedy School, Danny Schneider, has been studying precarious work, people who hold multiple jobs are subject to changing shifts, the non-traditional sorts of arrangements that are proliferating. And what he's done inventively is to create Facebook groups, which mirrors what a statistician would call snowball sampling, in which you're trying to build communities of people where you can actually get their responses to what their working lives are like. But once you do that, you also create an opportunity to elicit their opinions on what's going on. So we're being thrust into this world just as social scientists, in which our ability to study things is going to bring with it a necessity of engaging with the people we study as individuals rather than as data points in some completely digitized form. So that's one piece of it where there's a challenge there, but I think in meeting the challenge, we may find some new opportunities. The other thing I would want to stress here is the role of business in making this happen. And I think one perhaps underappreciated thing is the increasing mandates for ESG reporting and what this means for giving us a window into business employment practices. We still haven't defined what companies are obligated to report. We're really focused on carbon footprints right now, but ESG has a social responsibility element there squished in the middle. And that means we can design what we expect companies to say about how much they outsource, about the nature of the shifts that they offer, about pay trajectories for workers at different levels within the organization. And so we're in a position where we can, as a society, we can make that reporting mandatory, and that insights into business practices would obviously then change the nature of the discussion, because we see actually what the companies are doing.
Gordon, this idea of, and I'm going to turn Ashley. You started us off on this data trajectory, and so I'm going to have you push more on this. In traditional economics, we think of preference revelation by reveal preference. You choose A versus B, and that tells us what you really wanted. Now, obviously, one drawback in that approach is you can only distinguish between the two choices that are offered. If there are other amenities that no one offers, you never get preferences revealed about them. So you have an incomplete picture, which is often why you may not have seen flexibility may have been a huge issue throughout history. But if jobs didn't offer flex work and you couldn't choose a flex versus the non-flex work, you would never know how valuable this is unless you ask directly. So I want to ask you, you've done surveys on this as well. I want to ask you and say, do we have new tools that allow us to better navigate the preference space that workers are now seeing, especially if it's dynamically changing? And also, is having multiple employers a good thing from that perspective, or is it a bad thing to the extent that, as Gordon says, we're dematerializing the employer-employee contract as well, so we observe less? How are you viewing this space?
So I think this conversation is raising a really important set of questions. How do we provide employees with choice and control over where and how they work while still within the constraints of an organization, such that employees are contributing value? And I think we have been thinking a lot related to these issues around measurement, around the flexibility paradox. So especially in North American context, people will say that they want to be able to work from wherever, whenever. But often that preference, that strong desire to have complete choice over where and how someone is working, overlooks the fact that if you provide everyone with complete choice, it means we have less control over our day-to-day lives, because you don't know when another person is working. To the extent our jobs are interdependent with one another, if everyone is allowed to work wherever and however, in whichever capacity or from whatever medium they want in the knowledge worker space, this means we'll have to be constantly responsive all hours of the day and night, even more than we already are, because we're trying to align with people on very different schedules. So the way that we've been trying to think about reconciling what people say that they want with what works in practice to actually produce well-being related outcomes is a couple of things. So first, trying to understand what people's ideal work situations are. So how do people ideally want to work? How do they ideally want to collaborate and spend time interacting on an everyday basis? Then we pair these explicit stated preferences with diary data, where we survey people and look at when they were working in the office, when they were working from home, what they were trying to accomplish that day, and how satisfied and stressed, productive did people feel. So this gives us some insight into where people are making what happiness researchers call effective forecasting errors, where they're saying that they want work to look in one way, yet we see that when they're trying to enact in a collaborative interaction, or they're working on a task that's highly interdependent. They might feel like they can do that from home, but actually derive greater satisfaction from that activity when they're together working on that activity in the office. So we're thinking about how can we design surveys, both to understand what people say they want, but also why they want it. Why do people want flexibility? Well, maybe it's just that they want to take their kid to a doctor's appointment when they need to. And so by understanding why people want flexibility of where to work and when to work, we can actually solve what the need is that they have and help people better articulate why they want the flexibility that they're asking for. So we're thinking about this issue by looking at both surveys that ask people what they want and why they want that flexibility or work to look a certain way, and then surveying people on an everyday basis and asking them what they're doing and how they're feeling during those activities to really understand what is producing the most welfare enhancing activities and then outcomes rather. And then on your second point, I think you were talking about how fragmentation, how many being in many different jobs might erode the employer-employee relationship. I think this is a really interesting and open area to understand more. Even we're seeing this in the context of working in one organization. During this hybrid and remote work environment, people are now working on many more teams than they would have been part of otherwise. And so is that coming at a cost to, is this distributed work model coming at a cost to feelings of connection, belonging, institutional understanding, team building? And so I think these are really important questions, not just within firms, but across them, is how we can maintain the employer-employee relationship as work is becoming more fragmented, both in time, but also in terms of the number of different tasks or number of employees and colleagues that people are working with on an everyday basis.
Let me again pick up on this and continue on this thread and break order a bit. I want to come back to Gordon and then go back to Guy and then Ashley, you again. I want to bring in, and again, several of you said this, there is some employment which could be self-employment and atomistic employment or atomistic work, but most work isn't like that. Most work is joint production, which means other workers' preferences come in. And to the extent that those workers are brought together in a space called a firm, it means there is an employer there and that the employer's preferences and the employer's constraints start factoring in as well. So I want us to bring that, I'm going to call that space where we come together as an employer space right now. It could be a physical space. It could be a virtual space. Gordon, you talked a bit about the other side of the equation, which is there may be just a change in how firms are reorganizing themselves, who they're buying from, who they're selling to. Help us understand as that change evolves, what's going to happen to this? How do we get this equilibrium to work, given the demand for flexibility and independence? What are employers saying? What are you hearing from them? What is the nature of space there? Is there some alignment between the two? And if not, how do we start working towards that?
Yeah, your questions are getting harder as we go along. So, so I'll try and boil this down to just two comments. One has to do with the two very different ways in which the digital transformation of the workplace affects employer-employee relationships. And the second, what the COVID shock has meant for what companies want out of supply chains, that creates an opportunity to work against some of the negative effects of that digital transformation. So the upside of the digital transformation is that it allows us to flexibly form teams. And when you can do so, you might have workers who are younger, less educated, less experienced, that can now partner with much more senior folks than they would have gotten access to in the organization because of its flatness and because of that, as Ashley mentioned, this distributed nature of work. And that's great. What that means is that there's new opportunities to learn, develop, and advance within a company. At the same time, that same technology has the downside of turning the firm into a bunch of interconnected spot markets for labor, in which and companies may not want this. It may be the way in which things evolve endogenously as worker demands for flexibility and so forth get incorporated into the system. Every time somebody wants a little more flexibility, it creates a negative externality, and that it moves us away from the groupiness that digital technology allows us to create to more of the atomistic part. And I don't know how well business fully internalizes that, but the technology can take us in different directions, and we need to be mindful of the benefits of the first world and the demerits of the second. Then blending that to the supply chain question, here it's almost like where businesses realize they need to take a step back in time, where we want to introduce all the things that they got out of supply chains. We now appreciate we need redundancy, we need proximity, and we need simplicity. And those were all things businesses spent the last 3 decades trying to get rid of. In bringing those things back, we have the advantage of now a digitally transformed workplace, which allows us to bring some of those things in at a much lower cost than it would have in decades past. And I think that's, there's lots of reasons to be optimistic here, but we're way too early in the process to see exactly how that's going to cut, in particular for workers who are lower down the chain of authority.
Sorry, Guy, I wanted your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, I think a few very key issues are emerging from the conversation. I've learned a phrase which I hadn't been familiar with before, a preference revelation of it. This used to be called collective bargaining. I'm an old-fashioned sort of a guy. If I individually reveal a preference, my working life has told me if I go and talk to my boss individually, he'll say, well, that's terribly interesting, bye-bye. Surely we have to work out some way of going from, and I'm not trying to dismiss this, I'm not trying to be too funny, but if there is no power and there is no mechanism through which preferences can be realized in some sort of dispensation at the workplace, I wonder if we're going from theoretical constructs to the way things need to be done. And I think this is really, and I'm coming back to this institutions of labor issue. I really do think that these things are going to happen, and these things are going to go in the types of direction we would all like to see through collective representation of preferences and through employers, having to take, if they wish to or otherwise, hopefully enlightened employers who want to take notice of what collectively their workforce would like to see their working lives be. So that's perhaps the first point. The second point is, and I'm pleased it's been said so clearly, the employment relationship, the employer-employee relationship is fundamental to the issues that we are talking about. It's been increasingly difficult to fix and identify who is responsible within that employer-employee relationship. And digitalization is part of it. It's not the whole story. But the fact of the matter is that either we have an employment relationship or we have a purely commercial sort of speed dating relationship at work. And there's really no future in that. And there's a lot of protections around social security and all the rest of it that go out the window unless we get that right. And my third reflex, and as your questions get harder, as Gordon commented, you're going to have to put up with the answers getting more simplistic, because that's the way it is. It's getting late over here. Flexibility is a two-edged sword, isn't it? I mean, everybody, I'd be the first to say, I would love to have a working life where I can work when I want from where I want. That's sort of like utopia. The dystopia is having to work where somebody else tells you to at the time that person tells you. And that's all of the game of flexibility. It truly is. So what are we getting in some experiences in Europe? We are having serious discussion amongst employers and employees and governments about the right to disconnect. I mean, there is now a right to disconnect. That is to say, you cannot be expected to respond to an email. Your boss can't even telephone you outside normal working hours. You can disconnect as a right. We also have interesting sort of reflection of collective expression of preferences, a 4-day working week, now just been negotiated in the public service in Belgium. But these are not done by individuals put up their hand and say, by the way, can I come in 4 days a week? It's done through structured interaction between employers and employees and the public authorities. Sounds like yesterday's solutions, not tomorrow's solutions, but hey, let's look back where we came from too.
And let me push on that. I want to, even though you're claiming these are yesterday's solutions, I love the way you put it. Look, there is a way to get individual preferences, and we could, but at the end, this is a social discussion. This is a collaborative, collective discussion. Are there ways, as you were thinking about how the world is changing, Gordon talked about Facebook, are there ways that we're getting digital collective discussions happening? Can we create collective forces, not in the traditional way of bargaining as we were familiar with? Are there modern forms of collective bargaining that you're beginning to see that you think may hold some promise?
And perhaps before I try to answer that question, I promise you that I will, just a disclaimer, when I talk about these more collectivist solutions, these collective actions, that doesn't mean everybody has to work in lockstep, because you can arrive at collectively agreed solutions, which internally offer lots of options to working people. So it's not, we all have to work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, etc. It's not that. So there is much more within that shell than perhaps I was giving the impression that there is. Look, I do agree, and we're seeing it, aren't we, that there are, and amongst younger working people, I'm sorry if I'm spouting cliches to you here, but, the digital natives, etc. There really is an attempt to organize, network through digital means, and we see some interesting and sometimes spectacular results. It's encouraging. It's also visible in the gig economy space, and we're seeing it because of the nature of the work. Do I think this is the future, full stop? No. Do I think it's part of the future if we are going to be interested in these more collective actions? Well, yes, I do. But, and despite, the much heralded labor renaissance and activism renaissance, which we're seeing sporadically and here and there, this has not amounted in scale, this is my understanding at least, to the type of phenomenon that I think we will need to see. So, there will be a combination of the new and the traditional, if I can use that phrase, I think, as people try to organize their working life in the future.
You guys, that's very helpful. Ashley, reactions to this, or do you want to?
Yeah, so I want to pick up on something that Guy is saying and add my sort of unique take as a kind of micro-organizational psychologist. I think explicit and formal collective organizing capacities, formal policies are really important to consider in light of these discussions, but so are implicit and informal contracts that arise between employees within an organization. So as we're thinking about how these flexible work policies are going to be enacted and whether they're going to improve well-being and to what extent, it's important not only to understand the explicit policies of an organization or to understand the policies in a particular place, but also to understand how people are internalizing those norms and policies within their organizations. So I think if, to take some of these policies like the 4-day work week, like disconnecting at 5 p.m. seriously and see them work in North American cultural contexts, which are where we prioritize the ideal worker, someone who's, we give performance incentives to people who are constantly responsive. We need to be thinking, how can we create who are the cultural carriers in organizations, and how can we create micro communities within companies, within organizations, to not only champion these kinds of flexible work norms that preserve work-life balance, but also enact them within teams and subgroups that people are part of. So something that we've been advocating for, to take these ideas that do need to happen at the social collective level, but enact them on an everyday basis, is to encourage teams to have conversations around breaks, boundaries, transitions. In the digital environment where we can work anywhere and all the time, let's empower ourselves to have explicit conversations about why we want to leave at 5 p.m. or if we need to leave if we want to exercise or see a counselor during the day, that we should feel very comfortable in expressing those needs and desires. So I think in this conversation, to move forward and really capitalize on this opportunity for flexibility in this new model of work that we're building, it will be both systematic change, but also micro changes within communities employees are part of, that are going to be really important for changing habits and norms around work. So we've been encouraging teams to have month or weekly meetings about how work gets done, not just what work is being done. And I think that will help to take these conversations that we're having, these policies that are being instituted regarding flexible work, and have people feel empowered to live the values of those policies on an everyday basis, and not feel like they can't take advantage of the flexibility that's being provided.
Great. Look, I'd love to keep this going, but I want to bring more voices into our conversation as well. There's some fabulous questions submitted. Here's what I'm going to do. It's going to be quasi-arbitrary, so I apologize in advance. We have grouped, actually Faye has done a fabulous job of grouping questions in broad themes. I'm going to divert each one of those big themes to one of you. I welcome the others who I haven't diverted it to also, if they want to react to that, but I want to give a lead response from one of us. The order I'm going to go in is Gordon, Ashley, and Guy. I'm going to let you have the most fun questions at the end. But let me start. And for the panelists, the questions that I'm going to be posing to you are questions we've put in the chat. So you can actually look at the chat, but I'm going to quickly read the questions out so that our audience can see the questions being posed. I'm going to put them collectively just to kind of make it easier for you to respond. So Gordon, I'm going to first, the questions on digital and virtual work and all the way up to skilling, I'm going to hand over to you. And then, as I said, the other panelists should feel free to kind of add on to what Gordon said. And just to be clear, these are questions, let me just very quickly kind of summarize some of these questions that are being asked. And Gordon, I'm going to ask you then to respond. I hope you guys are able to see the chat. If not, then please do open the chat window as well. You should be able to see these pasted. Sanya Terlevic, who's a MPP candidate from Maastricht, asks, can digital transformation be used as a lever for more meaningful work engagement? Mirilani from Bright Money asks, what's the future of employment that cannot be moved to a virtual space? So Gordon, I know you think a lot about physical spaces. What about performing artists, small business owners, laborers? How are they kind of acting in these virtual, quasi-virtual worlds? Bruce Hecht wants to know what observations you have about hybrid work experiences. And then there's another question from Esmeralda Agassi on what is a hybrid way of learning? And this, I think, relates to the last question, Gordon, on skilling. So what does skilling look like? You mentioned skilling and the future of work. I know this is a lot to put on you, Gordon, but I figured since your connection is the weakest, I can get away with abusing my privilege more here.
Great, yeah, fantastic set of questions, and I'll try and be succinct so we have lots of time for discussion. On digital transformation and possibly moving us towards meaningful work arrangements, what immediately comes to mind is Albert Hirschman's insights on how we resolve conflicts within organizations, having the options of exit, voice, and loyalty. And digital transformation should enhance the role of voice in that. And we see evidence of this, especially in big tech firms, which now operate enormous internal labor markets, where when management kind of goes south from the worker's perspective, management hears about it, and we're collectively reflecting worker sentiment in a way that would have been much harder in the past. The problem is, in a fragmented environment, there's not similar aggregation mechanisms. And so what we're seeing is tremendous inequality in the opportunity to express voice. Technology offers us some solutions there, but they need to be organizational and political and social, because there's not an obvious business entity to organize this. I'm a deep believer in non-virtual work. Most of what we do will be non-virtual. And so we're focused on the virtual part because that's where so much change is happening. Where they connect is that demand even for non-virtual stuff gets intermediated by virtual platforms. So the distribution gets intermediated digitally, even for quite physical stuff. And so even in the world of work that's purely physical, you're seeing the digital role playing a much more important way in terms of telling you what to do and telling you for whom to do it. I don't have a lot to say on hybrid work. I think it's very early in the process. There are folks like Nick Bloom at Stanford who are studying this very closely, but it's going to take us a couple of years to figure this out because you have to separate the move to hybrid versus adjusting to COVID. And right now, those two things are conflated. And finally, on skilling, this is a really interesting area. What's happening is that business is coming up with new areas of practice in which they want workers to have skills. So to think of one example, so much of what the digital transformation of the workplace has required is thinking how we connect the stuff that comes out of the technology side to the human-facing part of the operation, which gets called the user experience. So it's an area of practice within companies that we didn't really talk about in the past. And now Google offers courses, Facebook offers courses, and there's an opportunity to do this online as our need for education kind of continually evolves. The exciting thing about this is that it's pretty democratic in terms of access. The challenge is making sure that folks know about the skills they need to be acquiring. And this is an essential challenge when it comes to disadvantaged workers. So there again, we have some real opportunity here, but it's going to take outreach unless we want that opportunity to create more sources of inequality.
Great, thank you, Gordon. Actually, I'm going to turn over to you. There's two broad sets of types of questions on perceptions, both worker perceptions and behaviors and employer perceptions and behaviors. Let me just briefly summarize both while you kind of absorb what's written so you can formulate a response as well. On the worker perceptions question, Hani Alone has two sets of questions. One is asking about kind of generational differences, boomers versus millennials, in terms of how they're thinking of future of work. They want a bit more sense of what is time poverty, time sovereignty, how do we think of this, how do we facilitate this? Then informal work, you've done surveys obviously, and it'd be nice to hear from you about there's a difference between formal, or is there a difference between formal and formal? This is the question from Asim I Khwaja. And then we have a bunch of questions from Maha Ismail, Alison Brock, and again, Asim I Khwaja, on thinking about employer behaviors, right? How should small enterprises think of technology? What are the organizations or organizational actors who don't want to work flexibly? How do we think about them? And what are the organizational systems? What was missing with the organizational systems that didn't produce product flexibility? And now that we think COVID has happened, do we have these opportunities that weren't available before? So let me kind of have you respond on those two broad buckets. And then I'm going to turn over to Guy afterwards.
Great. Yeah. So I'm going to first just start by responding to this question of generational differences. I get this question a lot, given that I study time and money preferences and subjective well-being. So in general, I observe in my survey data pre-COVID that older workers were more time focused. So they cared more about having more free time as opposed to more money. And that is driven in part by feelings of job security. Now, during COVID-19, what I observe is a shift in a bifurcation, if you will, in what people value based on generational differences, but also their impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic. So in a large study of graduating college students, I saw that younger generations cared, again, as I mentioned briefly, more about meaning and satisfaction. Yet to the extent that they were negatively financially impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, they cared more about financial stability than meaning or purpose. And I think as we think about what to offer employees, this is going to be an important pattern to keep track of. We also observe this in large scale global data, where under high economic uncertainty, people drive more job satisfaction from salary and pay than they do from the opportunity to engage in purposeful or meaningful work. So there isn't so much in my data generational differences as there are differences based on what people's concerns are in their everyday lives around financial security. So if people feel financially insecure, they might care more about stability and a little bit less about meaning and purpose. In terms of what is discussed around time poverty, time sovereignty, from a psychological well-being perspective, what I see over and over again in my data is that time poverty is really, it's both objective constraints, but really from a well-being perspective, it's how much control people feel like they have over their time. And we've heard this theme come up over and over again in this conversation. So the psychological perception of control, feeling like you've had a say in an organizational policy, feeling like you can speak to your manager, give voice to issues that are concerning you, give voice to schedules, and wanting advance notice on when you're going to work and where you're going to be expected to work matter a lot for subjective well-being. So as we think about time affluence and in this new world of work, it's really important to think about providing workers with perceived choice and control over when and how they work. Does that mean that they're always going to be working from home? Not necessarily, but how can we involve employees in that decision-making process so that they feel like their voice was heard? And then I think this conversation about honesty, so for organizations who aren't going to provide the opportunity to work from home as we reimagine this future of work and we come back from the COVID-19 pandemic, my colleagues have research on operational transparency that I think is important to mention. There's some real financial constraints about why organizations are not allowing workplace workers to work remotely, like the fact that they have huge real estate investments in major cities. So there are going to be some organizations that require employees to come in. Work on operational transparency suggests that to help employees feel better about that decision, you should be really transparent and honest about why you want workers to come back to the office. A couple of quick points I think that haven't been brought up that I think are worth thinking about as we think about hybrid work is one thing that my colleagues and I have observed from the COVID-19 pandemic is that certain kinds of activities are much harder in a virtual or hybrid environment. These are activities like informal conversations where a lot of job skills are transferred, where a lot of institutional information is transferred, or these informal hallway conversations, the water cooler conversations, the sense-making conversations after meetings so that junior people who are in that meeting actually understand what that meeting was about. As we move back into hybrid models, we need to be really conscious of making space and time for informal interactions for people who are not there in person to design workplaces that are equitable. So I think Nick Bloom and others will be, research will be really important. And this is going to be a key area as we think about hybrid work that we shouldn't lose sight of, is not only how to make it satisfying, but how to make it equitable. So everyone's in these sort of subtle conversations that can come up on a day-to-day basis that are so critical for learning, for feelings of belonging, and for institutional understanding.
Thank you, Ashley. So Guy, as promised, I've left the easiest questions for you. But we've talked about, look, these next set of questions, which are kind of broadly, we're putting in a policy implications bucket. There's a huge actor here that we haven't brought to the conversation, which is nations. What are countries doing? And Guy alluded to this to say the recovery is disparate at the national level as well. There are countries which haven't been vaccinated, but don't have the fiscal space to kind of get employment back, get some of these exciting new innovations back, afford the luxury of flexibility. And so I want to get these questions in and direct them to Guy as someone who's clearly seen these issues play out over the last couple of years, and frankly, over the last decade at ILO and before. So Guy, I'm just going to read these questions out for the audience. And as I do, again, you can think about which ones you want to respond to and how. So there's a question that Noor Ghazali has on how does a nation best prepare for this new future of work in the light of COVID crisis? What should we be thinking about at that level? Hani is worried about, what if we get another recession? What if we get another shock? Things are looking good for some countries, things are still tough for others. It seems like a broader question about not having the economic space to act. How do we act if we're feeling really fiscally or financially constrained? Orhan Mamadi from Azerbaijan also asks a similar question, which is, this is going to take a lot of resources to do this AI automation, digitization of labor force. What do countries which lack resources do? Do we just say bye-bye in some global sense and hope for the best and richer countries to move? And also, just to add this, and I know in your previous life, you've represented labor as well. Are you worried about discrimination by people who can choose to go online or not choose to go online? Is this going to create classes in workers in a way that both prevents collective bargaining but has long-term deep consequences on people's progression in their careers? Is that something you're worried about? So both this kind of nation level challenges that we're seeing, but also kind of collective labor level discrimination and issues that may be coming up. I said I left easy questions for you, guys.
Well, they're big questions. They're very wide-ranging, aren't they? I'll do my best. Look, let me say, the first thing I want to say is I think we need to place our conversation, in the broadest context that we can, and just take cognizance of a couple of realities, in global labour markets. The first one I want to mention, and I'm not trying to lecture here, 6 out of 10 workers work in total informality in the global workforce. It's 62%, going up to 90% in some cases. That's the first thing to say. And that means it's almost a consequence that the majority of the world's workforce has zero social protection, zero access to social safety nets. One of the interesting things about the pandemic experience was a number of governments who had to rush in the face of catastrophe, ad hoc social protection measures. We've recorded about 4,000 of those ad hoc measures. They're now being phased out. They're now being phased out. So the worry is we haven't learned as much as we might have done from the obvious inadequacies of social protection. Second reality, we're talking a lot about the benefits and possible pitfalls of remote working. Pre-pandemic, our best guess, I think that's the fairest way for me to put it, is that 18% of jobs being done in the world, that's 18%, were susceptible to being performed remotely. This is a minority pursuit. Let's be clear about that. That goes up to 30–40% in more developed countries, but we're talking about subjects here that would be more or less incomprehensible to a number of the ILO's 187 member states. And again, this conversation is vitally important. There are also wider conversations. And to answer that question, well, what should countries be doing to best prepare themselves for the future of work? What I detect in a lot of the developing world is a feeling of hopelessness in the face of change. Processes of change which are being dictated or are coming endogenous. They're not coming from the country, they're coming from external pressures. And the only thing people try to do is to survive them. Little notion of a capacity or the autonomy to prepare for it. That comes out in financial circumstances. That $19 trillion that's been spent in crisis response over the last 2 years. The very great majority of those resources has been spent by rich countries on themselves, and naturally so. It's not a complaint, but countries are not in a position to prepare themselves if they do not have the basic resources to invest in doing so. Be it investing in social protection, be it investing in vaccines, be it investing in closing the digital divide. So, this really does feel like a two-world conversation, if I might say that. All of that said, there is, and here I have, this is going to sound like blowing an institutional trumpet or grinding an axe here. We really do have to see the international dimensions of all of this. We truly do. And that's very, very difficult at a time of restrained resources in all countries. This is tough to do. We have some opportunities. You know, the International Monetary Fund issued, first time in its history, $650 billion worth of special drawing rights. The mechanisms of the IMF are that this money goes to the countries in proportion to their quotas at the IMF, i.e. the lion's share goes to the rich countries, some of whom are now committing to transfer them to developing and emerging economies and helping them get put to the uses that we need to see them put to. But it's not really happening, or it's certainly not happening on a scale commensurate with the problems that are being faced. And if you had to ask me, to go back to that question about preparedness, well, where should these resources, were they to be available? Very often they are not. Where should they be invested? I think it's a key question. I would go to the issues of social safety nets and social protection. Our estimate is it would take an annual investment of $80 billion to provide minimum social safety, we call them social protection platforms, for the low-income countries. That's a hell of a lot of money, but it's not impossible. It has to go into skills and learning, and I don't want to miss out on the whole lifelong learning agenda, which seems to bring a violent agreement, a violent consensus that we have to make a reality of lifelong learning. We talk about it incessantly, and we come up against three largely unanswered questions about what to do about it. The first is we have to work out who's going to pay, who is going to finance lifelong learning systems, not the smallest of questions. The second is I think we have to make an explicit understanding of who is responsible for lifelong learning. Is it the individual worker? Is it the individual? And you've pointed already, or my colleagues have pointed already, to the need to orient people, particularly low-skilled workers who are badly in need of refreshing their skills, but are probably the least well-placed to go to the right place and learn the right things. And the third thing, are delivery systems for lifelong learning. I mean, really, we're still in a situation where we think we learn at the beginning of our adult lives, then we work, then we retire, and then you know what comes next. We've got to reorganize biographies. Learning and working are going to be intertwined in the future. They're going to be concurrent parts of reorganized biographies. We know about this, we all agree to it, but I think we're still in the infancy of working out how lifelong learning will go. And the last bit, if you'll allow me the moment for it, Asim, is about, probably the biggest global problem that was there pre-pandemic. It's been there during the pandemic. It is waiting for us as we come out of the pandemic. And that is, of course, climate change and the fact that we have to reorganize our world of work and our productive systems to accommodate the necessary, not a choice, but an obligation, move to climate neutrality. We call this the need for a just transition to help people go in that direction. Again, we all know this, we all recognize it. We're having a hell of a hard time agreeing at the policy level, at the financial resource level, and then the basic labor market engineering that we have to do. If we do accept now, let's put aside the deniers, that climate change is a result of human activity. A very high percentage of that human activity is work or work related, but we have not drawn the consequences of that simple reality.
These are nice, big questions to raise. One thing Guy says, and I want to come back before we end the panel, just get quick reactions, Ashley and Gordon, from you, because I think it's an important question to ask. Guy is absolutely correct in raising this, which is, are we worrying about problems of the rich? Are some of the things that we're discussing, is flexibility as big a deal in in the majority of the world's workforce? I'm not necessarily saying Guy said that, but it forces us to start asking, is the idea of changing value chains, Gordon, that you were concerned about, or skilling, is the idea of digital workplaces, is this just, are we off in terms of thinking where the majority of the world's workers are, or are these issues just as relevant or not? And so I want to just quickly get Ashley, your and Gordon's reactions to that.
So I'll just comment a little bit on the importance of flexibility for workers worldwide. I think the question of whether flexibility is equally attainable for all workers is one very important question. And I think the answer, broadly is no, but maybe it should be, right? And then what my research speaks to is a psychological experience of flexibility and having control over time. And that, in my research, is is a universal. So when I study workers in Kenya and informal labor markets with unpredictable schedules, as Gordon brought up, I see that unpredictability, the lack of control over time, this feeling of not having enough time to do everything that someone wants to do or has to do, that this undermines well-being to the same extent for workers living in an informal settlement in Kenya as it does for workers here. But the instantiation of that, where the causes of those feelings of time poverty and the solutions will vary dramatically depending on the economic context, the job availability. And so I think from a research perspective, as a happiness researcher, I see over and over again that flexibility and control matters for workers worldwide. I think the solutions that will need to be offered will look very different depending on context.
Gordon, I don't know if you.
So when you look at the emerging world, we see a set of divides that are in many instances reminiscent of what we see in advanced economies. There's a digital divide. There's a formal informal divide. There's an industrialized region, non-industrialized region divide. That's the who compose the 60% of the world's population that Guy mentioned a bit ago that are informal, and making significant progress in terms of raising well-being for those individuals means in large part pulling them out of the informal economy into parts of the economy that sell their goods to the rest of sell what they produce to the rest of the world. That will need to be manufacturing in many places, and that's where the changing of supply chains, the broadening of supply chains has some real potential. But it doesn't have to be limited to physical goods. It can also be services, and there's opportunities with work from home. Work from home can be work from home in the US, it can be work from home in Mexico, it can be work from home somewhere in Indonesia. And here you are talking about workers who are higher up the educational ladder in those countries, but who haven't had the opportunity to participate in supply chains in service sectors to this point. Lots of challenges in making that happen, but also opportunities that we haven't really seen in a generation. What governments do in order to help break down those barriers and close those divides will be fundamental in determining whether those opportunities are in the end created.
Let me end us with one last, and this is going to be an unfair question to all of you, but I'm just going to ask it anyways. I wanted at the start, and Guy and others, you said this as well, I want us to leave on a message of hope. And my question to you is going to be give me one single thing, just 5 seconds, which gives you hope looking forward in your areas of work or expertise. Just one single thing. You can say a single word, you can say a phrase. I want to end with that message so that we leave. And I'm going to go, Ashley, with you first. And then Gordon and Guy, you're going to have the last word here.
I think what in my line of research, seeing the concerted effort and energized conversations about the burdens of unpaid labor for working parents all over the world and individuals all over the world has been a silver lining for me. I think there's a lot of energy around these conversations, and I hope that that can translate into policy impacts over the next several years.
Gordon?
So in the US and a number of other countries, we've seen this burst of new business creation during the pandemic. Much of it was by necessity. Folks needed alternative sources of income, but it has brought a new set of players into those who are managing and running and growing businesses. And I find that encouraging and exciting.
Guy.
Agreeing with my co-panelists, I would just say the realization which has appeared over the last 2 years in the public mind that the bottom end of our labor markets across the world are a swamp. They are too many people contributing very valuably to our lives, and it's been brought out to us so clearly by the pandemic, and are not getting rewarded in any way that could be considered commensurate with the contribution of work that they do, or indeed reconcilable with basic notions of dignity.
with that, as Ashley reminded us, the most valuable thing we have is time. And so I am grateful that the three of you shared time with us today. I'm also very grateful that our audience shared time with us today, because they are all over the world in different time zones. Thank you so much for joining us. Please do join us in a couple of weeks on the 23rd of March for our 6th panel on health. Thank you again for the panelists. It was a real pleasure to hear you all.